commitment with our full weaponry loaded and ready to engage this battle with those who have come to really push us back.
Times are tough right now. People are struggling regardless of the color of their skin. But people who are part of the Leadership Conference, every day they come to work at their organization, at the coalition table, fighting for those individuals. As long as we have this coalition, I am confident that we will win.
Welcome to the Leadership Conference Bend Toward Justice Conference. Please welcome to the stage the Leadership Conference Board Chair, Judy Lichtman.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for our Civil and Human Rights Conference, Bend Toward Justice. The Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights has been at the vanguard of civil rights law and policy for nearly 70 years. The work that our organizations have done in coalition during that time has helped to bring America ever closer to its highest ideals of equality under the law. That work is even more vital now. Through each of us representing organizations that lead on civil and human rights, we understand that the work we do together provides even a greater multiplier effect. Collectively, we make an enormous difference. I don't think I have to tell you that these are tumultuous times, or that every community we represent is under attack in some way, or that a good election this year is only a step on a long journey toward justice. You know all that. This conference is about the way forward, the work we must do to bend that arc. We've built this conference to inform, to inspire, and to incite you to act on behalf of the civil and human rights of every person in America. The day is full of wonderful speakers, presentations, and workshops. It's our hope that you enjoy today and leave with an even greater commitment to our collective work. On behalf of the Leadership Conference Board, I want to thank Vanita Gupta, her leadership team, and the Leadership Conference staff for their incredible hard work in putting this fabulous event together. The next speaker certainly needs no introduction to this crowd. You know her as a tireless advocate for civil and human rights, a relentless champion of equality and opportunity, and a thoughtful partner in coalition to ensure that this country lives up to its highest ideals. Ladies and gentlemen, President and CEO of the Leadership Conference, Vanita Gupta. Thank you so much.
Have a good rest of
you too.
Thank you for that generous introduction, Judy. We are so grateful for your fearless leadership. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, good morning. Welcome to the Bend Toward Justice Conference. This is really, truly an incredible room, and the fact that all of you are here this early in the morning, I am deeply appreciative. We have an amazing, amazing program today. I want to just, though, start by thanking the boards of the Leadership Conference and the Leadership Conference Education Fund, and the amazing staff that I get to work with every single day, the Leadership Conference staff, our coalition and task force co-chairs, so many of you are here today, and really each and every one of you, because each and every one of you is a member of the civil and human rights community. Conferences like this, anyone who's put on a conference knows that a conference like this is a real labor of love, And so I want to extend a special thank you to our EVP for Programs and Campaigns, Ashley Allison. I don't know where she is. I think she's over there somewhere. She has been a cosmic force in making this happen, and she and her team, which involves almost everyone on the Leadership Conference staff, have worked every day tirelessly through the weekends to make today happen, so thank you. Nearly 70 years ago, A. Philip Randolph, Roy Wilkins, and Arnold Aronson, three giants of a generation, forged this coalition out of the belief that the fight for civil rights couldn't be won by one group alone, but would need to be waged in coalition. And the Leadership Conference was founded in a time of unrestrained racism and dreams deferred. To be Black in America was to experience daily indignity and humiliation. But our founders came together not because of terror and tragedy, but in spite of it. They created this extraordinary coalition not out of common fear, but with common purpose: full equality for all. That common purpose sustained our coalition through the 14 long years it took to pass the most ambitious civil rights legislation in our nation's history, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and then the Voting Rights Act the following year. That common purpose gave our leaders the wisdom to see that civil rights are women's rights, our LGBTQ rights, our workers' rights, our immigrants' rights, our disabilities' rights, our human rights. That common purpose is our inheritance. It is a living legacy that binds us all together in cause and in community. Amid these uncertain days, we must choose to act out of love over bitterness and faith instead of surrender. We must choose to see possibility through our pain. Why? Because of the enduring belief that in a more perfect union that has always fueled the fight for a freer and fairer America. I don't need to remind you about the tragedies brought on by the Trump administration today. Let me just stipulate this to save all of the other panelists time. This president is the worst. He's terrible. But even after 2 years of eroding the rule of law, the threats to democracy, trying to shred decades of civil and human rights progress, we must remember and celebrate what we have accomplished together against all odds. Has anyone heard of the vote suppressor Thomas Farr? Yeah, can we take 1 second to acknowledge what happened last week to defeat his nomination to the federal bench? We're going to hear from a senator who played a really important role behind the scenes in making that happen later today, Senator Cory Booker. But we have to commend senators of conscience who finally put country over party. But make no mistake, we all made that victory possible. We've been fighting this for a long time, and it is our win. So too was the unprecedented movement that we mobilized to try to save the Supreme Court from Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation. We all know it was a devastating loss, but it was a worthy and righteous fight that I would fight all over again. We lifted up the voices of sexual assault survivors. We centered civil and human rights in that conversation. People nationwide mobilized to save the court, and that deserves celebration. But this coalition is also shaping the narrative around the 2020 census, which we know is going to be the basis for political apportionment and redistricting from 2020 to 2030. We're shaping the narrative around the fight to end mass incarceration. And you all are on the front lines of our democracy, fighting to expand access to the ballot and knock down barriers to voting. And we're holding those in power accountable, from Silicon Valley to Capitol Hill. And speaking of Capitol Hill and state legislatures, we've got to celebrate the recent midterm elections. Americans, by a wide margin, turned out for civil and human rights. This was in the face of unprecedented levels of anti-immigrant and racist, craven racist rhetoric. Civil rights voters rejected this. Civil rights voters in Florida restored the vote to 1.4 million people. That is the largest expansion of the suffrage since the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965. It was a powerful repudiation of the racial violence and discrimination that has plagued Florida's history, and later today you will hear from its chief architect, Desmond Meade. And we saw huge wins for the integrity of our democracy. Civil rights voters in Maryland and Nevada and Michigan voted to expand access to the ballot. Several states demanded fair elections by taking the politics out of redistricting. And Chris Kobach, an architect of the nation's most anti-immigrant, anti-voting schemes, lost his gubernatorial bid in Kansas. These victories happened against a backdrop of historic milestones. For the first time in history, more than 100 women will serve in Congress. Civil rights voters across the country elected a record number of people of color in state legislatures. We elected the first 2 Native American women to the U.S. Congress and the first 2 Muslim women, one of whom, Representative Rashida Tlaib, I am thrilled to welcome here today. But while not a total victory, the election results are a testament to the power of our common purpose, the power of working in coalition, the power of organizing led by those most directly impacted. And the results really remind us, I think, of a profound truth in America today. And that is that this nation can rise above discord and division, and we can reject immoral policies to make progress. But as we celebrate these historic wins, we can't lose sight of the immense work we have left to do. We must end the voter suppression that we saw in Florida, in Georgia, in North Carolina, and elsewhere. We've got to end it. And right now, as we speak today, we're witnessing a deeply undemocratic power grab in the state of Wisconsin to try to overturn the will of the voters, and folks are fighting. But we are working, too, with the newly elected Congress and our task forces on an affirmative agenda for the days ahead. And we will hold our elected leaders accountable. We're going to continue our critical work at the state and local level, because the power that we build and deploy locally fuels our ability to drive national change. Each of us has a role to play. At its best, our movement has always had to be everywhere at once. We've had to be in the courts, in the streets, in the halls of Congress, in state legislatures, in the media, and engage with the private sector. And the Leadership Conference is really, truly honored to welcome all of you in this room today, whose lives have been deeply impacted by injustice, but who persist in the march toward freedom. Those of you who invest in the necessary but grueling work every day of securing civil and human rights for the most marginalized and vulnerable among us. The advocates in the room who pour your hearts and souls into planning and organizing and building a movement. The men and women, the young people who are taking the fight for justice to state houses and to Congress and into your local communities every day. Dr. King famously said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." And we all know it doesn't bend itself, and it won't bend itself. We know that it continues to bend because we are lifting up our sleeves, rolling them up, and bending the arc ever so steadily towards justice and our highest values and ideals. So as we continue to mobilize, remember, this work has never been easy. We won't get the outcome that we want every time. But my God, if we can't fight, we cannot win if we can't fight. We just can't. And so we've got to reject cynicism, and we should remember that the Leadership Conference Coalition was built exactly for times like these, times that require bold thinking, persistence, and courageous leadership. So thank you all. I hope you have a spectacular day. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage from The Hill and Hill TV, Jamal Simmons.
Some excitement that's about to happen right now. Can you guys hear me? Is this mic on? Can I get the mic on, people in the back? Hello, hello, hello. How's that? You guys in the back? Let's see. Let's try it now. Can you hear me now? 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. It says it's on. I got a green light. Hello. 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me? We hear music. We hear people laughing. We don't hear Jamal talking. All right, I'm just going to talk to the people, right? Oh, wait, that's me. Hey, there we go. There we go. All right, very good. All right, we got an exciting little moment for you that's about to happen right now. I'm excited because I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, and so for me to get a chance to meet the woman who's about to come out right now, who is the new member of Congress from the 13th District of Detroit. Can we welcome Congresswoman-elect Rashida Tlaib. So, you're not a member of Congress yet, so can I call you Rashida? Is that okay?
Yeah, please
All
do.
Right.
I prefer it.
Now, let me know, though, if I get out of line.
No,
you can
it's
always
okay.
smack me aside.
I know
the
your
head.
dad now.
Yeah,
So.
exactly. You know my
Yeah.
parents. So,
I can call him.
this is not a joke. She does.
I would, actually.
I will tell you, my dad is a minister in Detroit and runs a community organization, part of the city. And he said he was not surprised when the Congresswoman-elect won her race because he said she was the person who called him the most. So this is exciting. So what you need to know about her, if you don't know, that she was a state representative for 3 terms. She focused on community issues the entire time while she was there. She went to, this doesn't mean anything to anybody who's not from Detroit, but she went to Southwestern High School, which if you're from Southeast Michigan, you know is one of the biggest basketball powerhouses of the 80s and 90s. So she was there.
We were really good at football, too. And we won the national debate championship that year, too, my class year.
And she has 2 boys,
Yes.
right? And the oldest of 14
Yes.
kids?
Mashallah, yeah.
Wow, this is, that's a lot. That's a house with a lot of activity.
It's a voting block.
Yes.
It's a voting block.
We have 5 boys in my house, so that was a lot of activity. I can imagine 14. All right, so welcome. I want to give you a chance just to kind of say something for the audience about, to start off, how you were in a race with 6 people, including one of them whose last name was Conyers, another one who was a city council president, a majority African-American district, and you won.
Yeah.
How did it happen?
I'll tell you, that's the part of the story that's so incredible that I think people don't realize is probably gives me the most hope and inspiration, is the fact that, you know, myself and Ilhan Omar and many of the women of color, this beautiful rainbow of color of women coming in, you know, I wasn't elected in a predominantly, you know, Muslim or Arab district. This is predominantly African-American white community, less than 5% Arab-American community. And it's spectacular that, you know, someone like myself and this community could have made history like this. And that makes this, you know, journey and the fact that I've made history and the fact that I represent this district where I was raised even more spectacular. You know, I don't underestimate the direct human contact. Most people that know me and my activism in Detroit know you know, I don't, not any mailer, robocall, ad on the television screen, any of that could ever replace the direct human contact that you have with people. And all of you know that do grassroots work, that door knock when you're talking to folks, it's not like you made an appointment, you're just there. They're in their moment and what's going on in their lives, and here I am, and that connection instantly happens. And I just kept doing it. We did 55,000 doors within only like a 6-month period. And yeah.
Those
and
are
it's
all
funny.
The organizers out there who
Well,
understand
the
what
organizers should know. You should see, as soon as you file and run or whatever, I had this, did a few fundraisers, and I was like, okay, I have enough to maybe hire 12 community organizers. And the local newspaper was calling like, we don't understand. We just saw your campaign finance report. Why do you have so many, what is all these people working? I said, oh, they're field organizers. They're on the doors every single day. And that's just how we were able to do it. 60% of what we were able to raise went towards just field and direct contact.
And what were the issues that really animated that campaign? Detroit's, in your district, Julie, is very varied. I mean, we talk about it being Detroit, but it's really a big chunk of kind of the southeastern Michigan area.
I could tell, the consistency on the doors, and in different ways they would say it, but they would be like, I was like, anything I should be, he said, just, are you going to sell us out? And I'm like, what do you, and it was a different way, but they just, are you going to be one of those that after election, you're just going to forget about us? Are you going to be one of those that votes with corporations? Are you going to be one of those that forgets we pay the highest car insurance in the nation? Are you going to sell us out? And that was the consistency at the door. And I can tell you what set me apart from the 5 other candidates in the race. I was going to only just vote the right way, but I was going to, so I'm creating 3 neighborhood service centers throughout my district. That's how I'm going to stay rooted. That's where I get my bill ideas. In the legislature, that's probably my biggest neighborhood service. I mean, the teacher came outside and she just came in and said, I'm a victim of mortgage fraud and this is what happened to me. And I was like, why did this happen to you? And I called the prosecutor's office and said, Rashida, there is no law to that criminalizes mortgage fraud. And I was like, that's ridiculous. And so those are the things that I think set me apart from my colleagues. And people may not know this. Congressman John Conyers was my congressman for, 50 years. Even with redistricting, he remained my congress member. And he was very courageous. And he voted against the Patriot Act when it was unpopular too. He voted against the Iraq War when it was unpopular too. And that kind of courage that he, put at the forefront, he didn't care, if the majority of his caucus was voting a certain way. And that kind of is in me as well. And that was something that even in the legislature, when folks said, leave the billionaire alone, that was allowing these massive trucks to go through your neighborhood, I said, never. I can't believe you are not, that this is happening. And so I think, again, that shine, people got that from me. And it's interesting, to this day, people still can't concentrate them all. Yeah. So before Flint happened in Michigan, I want to say a year before that or 2 years before that, I had gotten a call that there was these black piles on the Detroit riverfront. Massive piles, 40 feet high. I'm sure your dad told you about it. And it was, this black cloud of dust, and I didn't realize what was going on. And I saw the trucks come from Marathon Oil Refinery, which I grew up, that refinery in my backyard. And it was the fact that they were bringing tar sands in from Canada to this petroleum refinery, and they were producing these little pebbles like petroleum coke. And the state said to me, when I said, this is unbelievable, do they have a fugitive dust plan? Do you have permits? What's going on? They illegally dumped with no permits onto that same billionaire I went after, who pretended that he didn't know it was there. And I was like, yeah, right. He would literally evict his own mother, knowing him, from that property if he knew about it.
And
but
to be clear, this is the guy who owns the Ambassador Bridge. If you've ever been to Detroit and you've crossed the bridge to go to Canada or seen that picture, that is owned by a private company, which is another whole scandal.
Who went to jail because he doesn't follow the law for a day, and it was like celebration through the streets. But one of the things that I just didn't that as an answer, said that's ridiculous. It is toxic. It used to be on the EPA toxic list before they lobbied to get it off, these industry. I knew there was carcinogenic, all these kinds of toxins in there. And so it was a resident who was like, I wish we could test it ourselves. And I was like, that is a great idea. So without planning, my director of constituent services, Larissa, was like, what are you looking for? I was like, do we have any Ziploc bags? And she's like, underneath the cupboard. So she's like, where are you going? I said, I'm going to walk. And I walked from the service center. That's how close it was to the service center, and went right to the riverfront. It's industrialized, so it's not like your fancy riverfront. So it was pretty industrialized, and went over these tracks, a bunch of these gray piles. and got Ziploc bags of the petroleum coke and got it independently tested and released the findings. I got it at an independent, nonpartisan lab, this nonprofit organization. And right after that, that's when the mayor and everybody else got on board and removed the piles from the riverfront.
So you take hands-on government to another level.
And you should see, Jamal, people are like, she's crazy. She's one of those, oh my God, she's a state representative. Like, what is she doing? I was like, yeah, you try to get those removed now. Like, that's what you have to do. And
so you talk about, we have a lot of conversation in Washington about climate change.
Yeah.
You talk about environmental justice, and this sort of makes it real for people on the ground. How do you see playing out environmental issues? This is a good story, but how do you see environmental issues played out while you're in Congress?
I mean, I think, one of even just being there for Congress school, or what we call orientation, it's pretty evident that I don't think people understand the true impact of doing nothing. I know 1 of 5 children have asthma in my district. We have the highest rate of asthma hospitalization alone, just where those piles were. I have the 3rd poorest congressional district in the country. And they keep continuing authorizing air permits for my neighborhoods and continue to, just not feel like we deserve some sort of right to breathe clean air. We have the issue around water quality. I mean, I think 60 out of the 80 schools that have been tested in Detroit Public Schools now does not have clean drinking water. And it just continues to unfold to see now the impact. And so for me, I'm going to have to bring those stories, right? I want my families back home and my residents back home to feel like they have a seat at the table and that they have a voice there. They can never really always be able to afford to come here and testify before hearings or understand this process as much. And so for me to be able to kind of bring all of that with me every single day when I do fight for environmental justice issues.
So you said that you have one of the poorest districts. Number I saw was about 30% of people are below the poverty line in your district. How do you balance, or maybe you don't balance, but how do you balance the interests of those 30% of people with the amount of corporate investment that's taking place right now as Detroit kind of gentrifies and changes?
Yeah, and many people here might be working on this issue, but before I actually filed to run, I was the lead person that worked on community benefits agreements. And I actually got a ballot measure on the City of Detroit ballot initiative with Equitable Detroit Coalition and the Detroit's People's Platform. I was kind of their attorney, and we worked and created what we call Rise Together Detroit. And we said enough is enough. We had introduced an ordinance that said if you got a certain amount of public subsidy or a big tax break, then you had to be able to do a legally binding contract with the host community. And I always, when people say, well, Rashida, we already do that. We're the council members, we're the mayors. I said, but, I'm on my, 5th mayor in 8 years? Mayors come and go. City council members come and go. Just watch the turnovers. And what doesn't go away is the actual residents, the neighborhoods. They stay there. And that's who we need to be investing in having at the table. So I'm a big proponent of the community benefits agreement process, a legally binding one, not the conversion of let's just meet and provide these little trinkets of stuff that is not sustainable. I mean, we've been fighting to this day from billionaires like Dan Gilbert and others that want to do all this investment and development in Detroit, but they're for-profit development, and they're development where it's not a win-win. 70% of the people that work in the city of Detroit don't live in the city. 60% of my residents, 60% of all Detroiters that live in the city of Detroit work outside of the city of Detroit. Those numbers are evident that it's not a win-win. And so we need to shift that, and that's the way I believe it needs to be, is having actual host neighborhoods at the table.
You also ran on Medicare for All. Is that something you think will help your residents? Oh,
absolutely. I believe in universal health care, and one of the things that I struggle with, and yes, there should be some sort of balance, but Congress is about people, government's supposed to be about people, and so when you have corporations like the health insurance industry who were part of drafting the Affordable Care Act, and maybe that's why it's not perfect. That's the truth. And so when you have that kind of tainting of the process and so forth, I do think we end up leaving a lot of people out. And so with Medicare for All, and as we move forward, I hope that we as we move forward towards real universal health care, that we make sure that it's about those that are not in there for the for-profit element of it. And I really do think that we're getting closer and closer to it. People never ever thought that this even would be an agenda issue, but many of us ran on this issue, and we won because of that issue.
So I have a sticker that I keep on my computer. It says Detroit never left.
Yeah. Thank you.
So people say Detroit is back. Detroit
yeah,
never
Detroit
left.
can't. Detroit come back. I'm like, we didn't go nowhere. What are you guys talking about? Yeah, it's true.
So everybody else is back, right? Detroit's been.
Yeah.
But the question I have, we're talking about gentrification a little bit. The mayor didn't support you. A lot of the other big cities.
I wasn't the chosen candidate because I can't be controlled, I guess.
Right. So housing is a big issue as people begin to move back into cities like Detroit. We're seeing it here in Washington, D.C. I think a lot of communities around the country are having the same. Atlanta's having a very similar issue. What do we do about affordable housing so people don't have to move out as other residents move in?
And we all as activists need to be careful when we say affordable housing, because sometimes it's defined in a certain way that's not really low-income housing. And what I can tell you is, I'm going to support the grassroots work that's already been done about creating a housing trust fund in Detroit right now. It's not funded. And when Ford Motor Company came and bought this beautiful historic, it's going to hopefully be beautiful, but to me it's always this iconic, the train station. It's this historic train station in Detroit. And they came, and we're 3 years out from bankruptcy. I think we only have maybe $500 million or something or so cash in hand, or something really, really small. They want half of that towards this for-profit development. And I said, great, but can you maybe help provide the seed money for the Housing Trust Fund? Instead, the mayor's office came up with their own, they called it a Housing Trust Fund, but they gave it a different, sexy name. And they said, look, we did fund it. I said, no, that Housing Trust Fund doesn't go through City Council. It just goes through the mayor's office. And that's where the disconnect happens, where we don't have that direct accountability that happens. And the Housing Trust Fund is all intended, because if you look at my district, Jamal, less than half of my families own their own home. The biggest issue right now is they're paying way more, the percentage of they're paying way more of what the income is coming in for rent right now. It's so excessive. And so the Housing Trust Fund was an idea to basically try to get, general fund dollars to go towards that, towards making sure that we have everyone has access to rental properties. Because right now, I can see my city just changing so dramatically and so quickly. Mayor Coleman Young, who's our mayor for 22 years, believed in this progressive justice model for housing, where you mixed in. So you had maybe the low-income housing, but across the street was 80-20. So, and that's how you did it. And it really did help elevate people out of poverty. Now you have people getting pushed. So the low-income housing or subsidized housing now, those are being shut down after 20 years, and they're like, okay, we're not going to apply for the HUD. We're going to make them the bougie condos or whatever they are, and pushing out the poverty. And to me, if you look at even the seeds or the foundation of why we even had the rebellion in Detroit, it was because people pushed us out and just allowed the poverty to increase and the discrimination to increase.
You just mentioned Ford Motor Company. General Motors announced that it's going to lay off some employees and close plants. How do you, as a new member of Congress, engage on that with the company, as well as helping the residents who may be losing their jobs?
There's accountability here. We did a lot, from destroying a neighborhood in Hamtramck, Poletown, to the number of tax breaks that we've given to GM. And, I come from the Motor City. I mean, this is, when it comes to the big three, it's like whatever you want, the red carpet. Now we're kind of waking up to the fact that we can't do that anymore. And that's where I'm consistently pushing the community benefits agreement process. You want to get our public money. This is money comes out of school aid, comes out of city services. This is real money that we could be collecting, because they'll say to you, and you're at your city council meetings or your local, oh, well, it's not a check, Rashida. I said, yeah, but it's money we're deferring and saying we're not going to collect. So it is very much us handing over a check. And we don't ask anything of tangible, anything in return. because they say jobs, jobs. Well, one, jobs don't fix cancer. Jobs hasn't been able to really elevate a lot of us out of poverty. We got to have multiple jobs. There's so many things that we have to be pushing up against. And so I know the CEO, Mary Bart is going to be there, I think, tomorrow. And I'm going to ask those questions of, you're in the business, right? I mean, you understand that as a contract that we gave all this up in exchange of the promise that you'll continue to, obviously employ, but also be this kind of corporate neighbor. And now you're abandoning us after we did everything possible to help you thrive, to give you a home, and now you're turning your back on us.
So the person who sounds like he agrees with you about dealing with corporate subsidies is President Trump. What happened?
I don't know, his intentions are different, I think.
What if he calls you and asks you for your support as he deals with the company and tries to...
Look, I don't know what I would be supporting, right? I don't know what, he says things, it's like he legislates through Twitter, so I'm not really sure. I need to see something and understand what he's proposing.
Would you go meet with them? Would you go to the White House?
I mean, of course, I would meet with anybody. Everyone should know that about me. I will meet with anyone. I'm a person that, even if I disagree, I'll use a little bit of humor to kind of get over the anger. But I very much understand that, he is a different kind of human being. And well, I'm trying to be nice. In the one thing that, everybody keeps saying, what am I going to work on with him is, I really believe in the rule of law. Like, I believe that there's a way to do things without committing crimes and without, and so, and it's true. You all have to understand, I've watched billionaires literally disrespect, find those loopholes, do everything possible without following the law in my city for years. And that's what we have right now. If you come to my district, I always do what I'm going to create this tax abatement tour of my district so people can see these little islands that were created with our money and how the poverty outside of the boundaries of development is so concentrated, so profound. It's unbelievable to me that we allow it to continue to happen. So going back to, I think President Trump is, I think he's not going to be happy that somebody like me is going to talk about accountability in a way, just like he wants to hold GM accountable. I need to hold him as well accountable to a lot of things as well. So,
do you think that President Trump's engaging in a culture war?
I don't know what he's doing. I think there's so much, even when I watch national media outlets, it's baffling because we're all guessing. It's all guessing, what is in his mind? What do you think that tweet was about? See that letter, Sessions' letter? He probably forced him. It's like we're all guessing. And that's the thing that I think...
There's some things he is doing. He was taking children away from their parents at the border. Yes. He did send the troops to the border in a politicized military exercise.
I mean, he's talking about creating his own media outlet.
Taking over Voice of America.
Yes. My first gift to my new members of Congress, the freshman class, the Democrats, is a book this amazing group put together called The Case to Impeach President Trump. And in there, you can see from what President Nixon did to a number of kinds of actions, how they so much integrate or are very much related to what President Trump is doing today. I can tell you that I think there is so much more courage and moral compass with this new class I've never seen before, but maybe because I'm on the inside, I don't know if you all feel it, but know this, when I say something and I get a couple of the women next to me I'm like, okay, I'm not alone. This is great. So just know and be hopeful that there are folks that are going to be calling out, not only caging children, but a number of things that he's doing on a number of fronts, especially regarding the big tax break he gave to corporations.
Well, you have a front row seat on this. They're going to have us close in a second. But you have a front row seat on this, and I want to really get your opinion here. Because President Trump won Michigan. He won some particularly white, disaffected workers. You've got a lot of those workers who are in your district outside the city of Detroit, yet they've got the first Muslim American woman one of the two first Muslim American women in Congress.
Yeah.
How do you navigate with a president who's willing to have a Muslim ban, send troops to the border? I mean, he really does go after issues of race as a polarizing weapon. What do you do to combat that?
Look, I truly believe he's racist. And it's probably controversial. He is. It's in his policies. It's in his words. And the fact of the matter is he's still our president. Until he is not, but it doesn't matter. I'm going to still hold him accountable. I mean, that's my duty and that is what people are probably elected us to do. But I can tell you just also, when folks tell you that we turned red district into blue, don't let them feel like we somehow flipped Trump supporters. No, no, no. Michigan, 4 years ago, 3.1 million people came out. 4.3 million people came out this time around. If we increase voter turnout by 2% alone, in Detroit by 2%, if we increased it during the presidential election, he would have not won Michigan. So please do not think my state is somehow red. It's because they weren't inspired to come out and vote, and that's something we're going to continue to change, hopefully, in the next cycle. So.
I think the folks here found you to be inspiring. Thank you for being here. Hope to see you again.
No, thank you so much. Thank you.
Rashida Tlaib.
Thank you.
Congresswoman-elect for Michigan.
Thank you. You go this way.
Let's now welcome to the stage our Civil Rights Leaders Discussion Panel, Alan Brooks LaSure of the Leadership Conference, Rabbi Jonah Pesner, Religious Action Center, Rebecca Coakley, Center for American Progress, Fatima Goss Graves, National Women's Law Center, Ambassador Keith Harper, and Mara Kiesling, National Center for Transgender Equality.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for our civil rights panel. We're talking to leaders of the movement about where we are
I understand.
and where we're trying to go as a movement. Sounds like someone else is joining us on the panel. So I'd like to start off with an easy question for our panelists here. Why are you in this work? We'll start with Mara.
I have to be. I think I'll leave it at that. I just absolutely have to be.
What would happen if you weren't?
I just can't imagine it. I'm sorry to be troublesome so early in the panel, but
there's always one on a panel.
It is a
Thank you.
It is a personal imperative.
Personal imperative. Thank you, Keith.
I'm in this work because I have realized over time that nothing, especially now as we look at what's happening in our country, the imperiled state in which we are in, the challenge to fundamental principles and values of our nation. This work is imperative because it is only through this kind of work that we can achieve justice and equality and live up to the base principles of America.
Thank you. Fatima.
I'm almost with Mara. I mean, this work is personal. I would be doing this work whether I was at the National Women's Law Center or not. I think I was doing this work before I knew I was doing this work. It is urgent, it is personal, and the work that we are doing is working to improve people's lives, and it feels more urgent than ever before.
Great, thank you. Rebecca.
Because today is my 40th birthday. And
Happy birthday.
And I've been doing this work for 20 years now. And I can tell you that still today, if disabled people are not at the table, they're put on the menu, not just by our enemies, but by our friends.
Great, thank you. Jonah.
Well, happy birthday.
Thank you.
And what an incredible panel. Amen to everything that's been said, and I will only add that the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights is the most important community. God put us in this place at this moment in time for a reason, and we at the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism always proudly remind people that the Leadership Conference, its first office is here in Washington, we're in our offices in DuPont Circle, and that's why the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act that Vanita referenced earlier were actually drafted in our conference room. And we in the Jewish community have been showing up for justice for 5,000 years since we marched out of Egypt. And we will show up for 5,000 more years if that's what it takes.
Great. Jonah, I'd like to ask you a follow-up question. Last year in September, you co-authored an op-ed in the Washington Post with Reverend Dr. William Barber, and you included an interesting line that jumped out at me, and it said that we must hold ourselves to a higher moral bar. What do you mean by that?
Thank you for the question, and it's an honor to be Reverend Barber's sojourner in this work. What he and I think meant was that we need to turn the mirror of injustice on ourselves, on our communities, on our congregations, and our institutions. 3 very specific examples. We have done a deep dive into the racism and white supremacy even within the Reform Jewish movement. We are a majority white denomination of Judaism, although about 10% of Jews in America now are of color. And we've really tried to do a deep dive into racial justice work within to ask the questions about how we are both perpetuating systems of white supremacy and excluding the Jews of color among us and oppressing them inadvertently in ways that make us hypocrites as we fight for racial justice externally. We need to live our values internally. I would just briefly add also, when we became the first major religious denomination in America to take on trans equality, we said we have to make sure that our synagogues are equitable and loving and embracing of trans people, not just schools and the military. And then finally, pay equity. We realize the same patterns of inequality in pay according to gender happen within our own congregations as happening in the world at large. So we got to fight within in addition to fighting beyond.
Great, thank you. Mara, the question to you is, why are all of you here during this time? Why is it important for all of these groups to be at the table in this civil and human rights fight?
Well, we're all under attack. So I'm going to interpret your question to mean, why are we all working together? And I look at a little bit of data from our survey of 28,000 transgender people we did a few years ago, and we saw that a quarter of our folks didn't go to the doctor last year when they needed to because they were afraid of being disrespected or discriminated against. But a third, 10% more, didn't go because they couldn't afford it. Sometimes when you're transgender, the biggest transgender problem you're facing is poverty. Sometimes the biggest transgender issue you're facing as a transgender person is racism. Sometimes it's the economy. Sometimes it's all these different things. So we know that we can't be an effective transgender movement or an organization if we aren't also an anti-racist movement, a pro-worker movement, pro-disability rights movement, pro-women movement, et cetera. The leadership conference is a way to make that real. As trans people have been attacked this last 2 years so viciously by this administration, every time we're attacked and we stand up, we look, and the National Women's Law Center is next to us, the RAC's next to us, LCCR is next to us, the Muslim advocates are next to us. So when there's a Muslim ban, we're there. When they try to defund Planned Parenthood, we're there. It is how to be both moral, but also, very importantly, how to be effective.
Great. Quick question, Rebecca. You mentioned that cross-movement solidarity is our only means for survival. What do you mean by that?
You know, I think Mara just gave such a great example of that, and I can tell you that our people exist across all of our movements. You know, whether it be disabled folks. I mean, we know that roughly 1 in 4 people are people with disabilities. So while I'm sitting on this stage as one of 5 panelists, there are probably at least 20 of my people in this room, and probably more of you that don't disclose, but you affiliate with other civil rights movements. If we don't stand together in these times, I mean, I think one of the biggest examples that I can think of is last summer when we saw the conversation around the Masterpiece Cake Shop case. We saw the Muslim ban. We saw HR 620 in the disability community. We saw all of these attempts to push people that this administration sees as different, deviant, or less than to the margins of society, and to actually block us from accessing society. And I think every time that happened, we came together as a coalition and said all means all.
Great, thank you. Fatima, what is the biggest impediment facing this civil rights movement right now? What is the biggest obstacle that's stopping us from realizing our goals? It's an easy question. I save that for you.
Softball. So I would say there's 2 types of things. One is structural, right? I actually think for some people, they thought in 2016, white supremacy just became a thing, or misogyny just became a thing. It was revealed, right? And sometimes it's helpful to see the structures that are really underlying the oppression that people are experiencing. So that is the upside of this period. But I will say, I'm going to reframe your question a bit. One of the things that I think is most challenging right now about what we are facing is the pace and the intensity and the chaotic nature of the attacks that we are facing across all of our issues, across all of our communities. And that puts a tremendous strain on people's ability to actually notice, identify, and address the many attacks that we're facing. It puts a strain on people. You know, I don't know how many people over the last few weeks have said, I just feel like I need a break. I'm going to stop watching TV. I'm going to turn it off so I don't know what's happening. But it's still happening. And that is an on-purpose strategy. That sort of chaotic and intense and unrelenting attacks designed to sort of tear us all down across all of our issues, across all of our communities. So that, I think, is the biggest thing that we are facing right now. It is that these systems have been revealed, and they are coming at us intensely, and we cannot look away.
So let me ask this question. This is a panel-wide question, whoever wants to jump in. What is the state of the civil rights movement the day after the last day of this administration? What condition are we in? Are we burnt out? Has everyone fled? Are we just too worn down to press ahead? What is the state of the movement then?
This is after the leadership conference holds a huge party. I don't know what the leader is. But there's a mandate for that.
I would say, first of all, we should say that I'm going to presume for this question that's 2020, not 2024. And I think that's a reasonable presumption in light of the very important midterm elections. And let me just say a word about that. Trump is an autocrat. The only reason we haven't moved closer to autocracy is because of the systems in place in the United States that are not in place in other places. I mean, if you look at Erdogan in Turkey or Orban or Putin or Duterte, he shares those values. But we have a system that is held. The reason this midterm election was so vital is that when autocrats win elections after they've taken steps towards autocracy, then they double down. And this is a line in the sand, and I think it is a rejection of Trump and Trumpism and its vulgarity and its mendacity. 2020, when Trump is out and there is a sane president in the White House, I think it's a matter of re-engaging and defining objectives and coming up with strategic plans to achieve those objectives. It's the time for action. And I think that we will be tired because of the battle of this last 4 years, but it is time to redouble our efforts to make this a more just society.
Can I jump in?
Please.
One of the things that I think is interesting is, first off, I want to be very clear and say when it comes to that person that resides at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, it's not a question of sanity or insanity. He is a bad person, he is an evil person, and labeling it and tying it to mental health is extremely damaging to my community. And that's not okay, and we as a collective civil rights space have to stop doing that. We can call, I like to use the same term that President Obama used for Kanye. He's a jackass. He's not one of our people. We don't claim him, nor will we. The day after...
Wait, you talking about Kanye or the president?
Either one of them. But I do think it's really important to note that, let's be honest, the system we had before Trump wasn't working so great for marginalized folks either.
Right. That's right.
And so it's not enough to just say we're going to, go back to the way things were. I honestly think that we have an opportunity to look at some of these issues. How is systemic racism integrated into the structures in our country? Why is it that disabled people can't work and have health care? Why is it that we continue to place restrictions on the ability of trans folks to live the lives that they want to lead? And how can we go back and make this a better America for Americans, for all Americans?
I mean, I totally agree with you, Rebecca. I mean, one of the things that has emerged in this period that has been, frankly, beautiful is the activism primarily led by women. And it is strong. It is not going away. It won't be like, oh, Trump's gone.
Yeah.
But, no, people have been awakened in ways that are so interesting, and it is personal, and it is showing up in all sorts of ways. It's showing up digitally with Me Too. It's showing up with people challenging their workplaces, and it's showing up for the highest numbers of women elected to Congress in history. So I actually think that planning, that strategy work, that real vision of work about that asking that question of what does it actually take to live and work with equity and dignity and safety and bodily autonomy, that starts now. That started before. And so people will be ready with plans. And there may be some tiredness, and so I believe in people tapping in and tapping out. We're going to need to do that. But there's no slowdown in 2020. Mm-hmm. That is the time to put that plan into action.
Yes. May I jump in? Oh, please. Sorry.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on what Fatima just said. It's the difference between 20 and 24 is really, really important. Yeah. And we need to understand and we need to absorb that it is easier to win re-election than it is to get elected in the first place. We cannot go into 2020 thinking, oh my God, everybody hates him, nobody will re-elect him. He has a big advantage in 2020. And the difference between his administration ending in 2021 and 2025 is catastrophically different. It's 4 more years of degradation of our society, of our laws, of our environment. It will be harder in 2025 than in 2021, and we really need to make sure that we're all buttoned down, and I say this in a totally nonpartisan way, that we make sure the elections go the way that individuals believe they should go.
I would echo that and go back to the original question, which is the health of the civil rights movement, right? That's the real question, because waves don't happen. We organize waves. We're going to hear from Desmond Meade in a few minutes. I got to tell you, a year ago, Desmond came to meet with me in Boca Raton, Florida, and propositioned that we might engage the synagogues across Florida. We have a nice base in Florida. I don't know if people have noticed. Jewish community has a base, okay? We had Desmond and his allies move from synagogue to synagogue Friday nights, giving the sermon, telling his story, talking about voting rights, and in a purely nonpartisan way, because we have a very diverse Jewish community. Thousands and thousands of Jewish people, mostly white, showed up with Desmond's coalition to win that ballot initiative. And it was because of an incredible coalition. We thought it was our thing. We didn't realize it was like all these groups across the spectrum, across lines of difference, come together. That, to me, is the health of the civil rights movement. When it's Muslims and Christians and Jews and different advocacy organizations, all crossing lines of difference, to come together to hold electeds accountable to our values and what we believe America ought to look like. That's when we win as a civil rights community.
Great, thank you. This is also a panel-wide question. Many times when we invoke the term civil rights or civil rights leader, there's a very crystallized idea that most people have in their heads of what a civil rights leader looks like. And they see grainy black and white footage and they hear speeches from podiums in their head. But what is a 2018 civil rights leader? Who is that now? Open to the panel.
Leadership comes from a lot of different places, and so I actually think if we have shed the idea that there is not one idea of who is a civil rights leader, then we're doing our job. I think if you look at the leadership of people in this movement, it is the leadership of the hundreds of members of the Leadership Conference of Civil and Human Rights, but it is also the leadership of activists around this country doing this work in community who are deep partners, and they are every age, and they are every religion, and every race, and every gender, and every sexual orientation, and gender identity. And I actually think we do a really giant disservice if we discount any type of leadership. So, and I'm ready to follow the leadership of, the 11-year-old girl who reminded us at the March for Our Lives that she'd be voting in 7 years, and all of us adults need to get our stuff together. So, I just think there's not one idea.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I'd build on that and the image of that young leader at the March for Our Lives. I was reminded when I met David Goodman, Andrew Goodman's brothers, Cheney and Schwerner. David reminded me that when he was a little boy, he remembered when his older brother Andrew came home one day and asked his mother to sign the permission slip to allow him to go on Mississippi Summer. Wow. That's how young Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner were. We nostalgize it, right? We kind of have this, there was danger and there was threat, and our young people led then, and our young people are leading us now. And what I'm so moved by is the students from Parkland who have organized not only their own base, but have met with teens right here in Washington, D.C., with teens in Chicago who understand the intersectionality, and that gun violence happens in these massacres in mostly white, affluent suburban districts from time to time, but they're a daily occurrence in some neighborhoods of color. And so they've built this kind of intersectional movement of young people to really challenge the gun violence plague in our country. That's, I think, where we will see the kind of new leadership that we need.
So let me ask a question.
Actually, can I jump in?
Sorry, please.
with this kind of panel, it's like, how can you not jump in? One of the things that I was thinking about is, I imagine a civil rights leader that doesn't feel like they have to hold any part of themselves back to lead.
Yes.
I was talking to a colleague who's an activist in the immigration movement, who is very outspoken about the fact that he had just gotten his 20-year chip from AA, and he talks about it in his activism all the time. This colleague of mine also has an anxiety disorder. And so I said to him, I pulled what I like to call an Andy Imperato, because if you know Andy Imperato, he's probably challenged you with this sort of thing before. And what I said, I was like, okay, I'm like, every time I hear you speak, you talk about your chip. How about you try talking about your anxiety? And he looked at me and was like, what? And I was like, try it, see what happens. And I gave him the advice that I was given about talking about my own mental health disability, which is, when you bring your whole self to the table, it allows more people to see themselves in that movement. And so he talked about his anxiety and at a big immigration rally. And when he came off the stage, literally there were 100 young immigration activists, all there that had mental health disabilities and other disabilities, that said, I never thought I could bring that part of myself to the table. And I think it shows a real failing across all of our movements, that within each of our movements, our young activists are still feeling like they have to hold part of themselves back, instead of seeing it as part of the armor that they bring to the work that we all do.
Rebecca, one of the things that we see when we look back in the movement from the 50s and the 60s is that there was a tension between the young people and the so-called older people, even though they were in their early 30s. When you talk about SNCC and the SCLC, there were tensions there where they talked about the kids. And there was a fundamental question of how to integrate young people into the movement in a way that does not require them to hold back. How do we do that now?
Are you asking me this because I'm 40 now? Does that happen when you turn 40? Do all the answers come to
I
you?
just assume you were a young person.
Oh, yeah. Coming up in the disability rights movement, literally being born into this work, my dad ran a Center for Independent Living, and my mom ran a disabled student center at community college, and both of them were little people. I think there's a lot of structural work that we need to do within our communities. I think a lot of times we're seeing folks talk about young people's organizing as slacktivism, when for a lot of folks, it's hugely effective. Can you guys imagine organizing without Twitter or Facebook? Years ago, my colleague Erica Williams was on a stage very much like this at the State of the Black Union. And one of the things that Erica said was that the elders at the time kept talking about Facebook and Twitter and change.org and all of these things as just, like cool little toys that the young people invented. We would never talk about those things now. And so I think it's important to remember that innovation comes from our young people, and none of our movements would have ever succeeded if not on the labor, both paid and significantly unpaid, of our young people. And I think referring to them as young leaders is crap, because they're leaders. And the minute we start implying additional labels on that, we do that to keep them out of the tables of power. That's right. And what they're going to do, and what I tell them to do, is build your own tables and don't invite us.
Thoughts? Other thoughts?
I'm old. I completely agree with Rebecca.
Well, the only other thing that I would add, because I totally agree with Rebecca, but that sometimes I think that, and this conversation has been really rich within the women's community, and especially in the 2016 campaign, there was this narrative that younger women and older women had nothing in common. And I think that's just it oversimplifies things. That sometimes people are almost talking different languages, but if there are more and more opportunities to have intergenerational conversations and intergenerational work, I think we will be stronger across our movement.
And honestly, I think that's the role of the leadership conference. I mean, years ago, back in 2009, Wade and the crew took all of the membership organizations down to New Orleans for a week right after the election to organize. And it was a whole meeting, it was a phenomenal meeting on succession planning. And each member of the leadership conference came and had to bring next generation, because I'm not calling them young leaders, a next generation leader with them. And we had a lot of those conversations. But I think one of the things that was fascinating was how hesitant, with the exception of Wade, everybody was to have that succession planning conversation. Which anybody that knows Wade knows it's not a surprise. I mean, he had talked about this for a long time, and it's one of the reasons I think that actually made him a really good ally to a lot of young people in the movement, was his willingness to have these conversations. You know, and I think it is that, like, how do we pull folks together in a room and engage in that dialogue? That's so important to have going forward.
So Rebecca, I am happy to endorse any idea of taking a trip down to New Orleans. So thank you for bringing that up on stage.
Vanita,
I didn't pay you to do that.
At?
So Vanita, thank you for our trip to New Orleans. You raise an interesting question that I'd like to put out to the entire panel, and it is one of transition of power within the movement, right? A lot of times we're talking about power outside the movement, but we've had some power struggles within the movement. How can we get better with that? How can we be more thoughtful about this transition of power, being thoughtful about bringing in not just a new generation, but a new cohort of people who want to be involved in this movement?
Well, I've been at the National Women's Law Center for a very long time, for over a decade. It was founded in 1972, but I've been president around a year. Mm-hmm. And the leadership transition within our own organization was very much planned. It was, it wasn't sort of, and if you know us as an organization, that shouldn't surprise anyone that it was planned, but it was very much planned. And I think as movements, if we are to be movements that sustain for the long haul, and as organizations within movements, if we are going to continue to be organizations that sustain for the long haul, we have to be planning for that at all levels, right? We have to be growing leaders at a lot of different levels, and we have to be planning for transitions on purpose. It cannot just be that all of a sudden we look up and we say, we don't have a plan, and who is leading, and we don't know any of the people who are doing the most powerful and vibrant organizing in this country. That would be a giant mistake, and one that if you aren't continuing to grow and foster relationships and leaders, you will make.
Okay, thank you. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would just invoke Reverend Barber again, and something he reminded me often when I travel. I went down to North Carolina, and I told the story of the Voting Rights Act being written in our conference room. And he stood up and he said, "Rabbi, let me correct you. The Voting Rights Act was not written in your conference room. It was written in blood in Selma and transcribed in your conference room." I carry that with me as a reminder to get with the grassroots and then get out of the way. I think all of the national organizations in this room, like mine, have to be really humbled by where our people are, where our power is at our base. Mm-hmm. For me, it's 900 congregations across North America. It's 2 million people who call themselves Reformed Jews, many of whom are under 18. Those are my people. We need to let them lead and then get out of the way of their leadership and harness what they are doing with us to take us where we need to be.
You know, I think for the disability community, we're used to always having to expand our leadership because the definition of disability is always evolving. Whether it be Zika, whether it be conversations around postpartum depression, whether it be, I was in Ferguson 2 years ago talking to activists, and just as you have that line from Reverend Barber in your head, for me it was Tara T. in Ferguson who said to me on a panel, "Rebecca, I don't believe in PTSD." And I stopped and I looked at her and I was like, okay, wait, stop the panel. We need to delve into this. Like, Tara, where are you going? And what she said to me is, she's like, because there's no such thing as post. Post is a fallacy. She said, because as Black women in Ferguson, Missouri, we are constantly traumatized, stressed, and disordered. There is no, she's like, post is a fallacy. And it blew my mind in thinking about how the disability community thinks about who our constituency is. Because I had never thought about that. And the fact that we come to movement work, nobody comes to movement, okay, how many of you are in movement work because of no trauma at all? Okay, no, there's not a single hand up in the room. How many of you have acquired trauma as a result of movement work? So all of you, welcome to the disability community. We've actually been waiting for you for quite a while. The head of AAPD is up here, Helena Berger. She'll be glad to talk to you afterwards. But we're used to having to continue to expand our community because that's the reality. And so I think thinking about who is in our spaces as a fluid thing versus a structured thing, we have to do it if we're going to survive.
I'd like to follow up on that. Rebecca, our movement, as you know, is very much the same way. What is a transgender person has evolved in people's thinking, including our own. And I would say in the larger civil and human rights community, transgender people are a relatively new part. We first approached the leadership conference around the turn of the century, this recent century. And I think it's a good model for how things should be. Frankly, there were people who were sort of surprised, kind of like, oh, what? We're this kind of people? We didn't expect this kind of people. Yeah. And we had to push a little, but it was always understood throughout the leadership conference and throughout all the organizations, as far as I know, that we were allowed to push, we were allowed to show up, we were allowed to step up and work with people. Going back to talking about younger activists, when I talk to young queer activists, I always like to tell them how things were 15 years ago. Mm-hmm. When I met with the minority leader in the Pennsylvania State Senate in 2001, and after he wouldn't do what we wanted, and we won anyway, he pulled me aside. I was the only transgender person in the delegation, and he said, but Mara, look at the bright side. 5 years ago, I wouldn't have let you in my office. And in 2004, I don't blame Senator Kerry or Secretary Kerry for this at all. I don't believe it was him. I believe it was his staff. I was on his LGBT leadership committee or whatever. They bent over backwards multiple times to keep me out of the same room with Senator Kerry because they could not risk having his picture taken with a transgender person. Now that seems absurd now, but it just shows the evolution. And I think how the leadership conference did it was a really good way, because we were in the middle of fights on the hate crimes bill and on the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. And I know there were people in the coalition, good, well-meaning people who were like, oh man, we got to change it again, and this new people are coming in. But they understood that they had to learn, and they had to figure it out, and they had to give us some space. And we pushed, and they yielded. And I'm very proud of everybody for that.
Can I say one more thing? I was just thinking about part of what you were saying, Rebecca, and I think that we cannot forget in this work to make space for healing as a part of our systems of accountability. And you guys are doing eloquent jobs of quoting people, and so I will not quote, but just take inspiration from Tarana Burke, who reminds me again and again that my understanding of what accountability really looks like is far too limited. And it's far too limited because we have been okay with systems that don't allow for healing. So I want to just keep pushing us.
So Fatima, can I follow up on that? What does it look like to have systems that leave space and room for healing?
Well, it's interesting. So I will tell you how I was thinking about it before, which was, way too tied up in the law, right? Way too tied up into, we need to change the rules, right? And we need to change how it is that we as organizations or whatever institution that allows violence and that allows a range of oppression to occur. How do we make them accountable, and how do we trigger them to act differently, right? And rules and laws are one way. If you actually flip that a little bit and center the experiences of people who are most harmed, and think about what does it look like for you to actually have justice and to heal, the answer may be very, very different. Right? For them, healing may not be my version of the rules and laws. And so one of the things that is important for the work that we do whether it is the work around survivors or beyond, is to really put at the center the people who are most experiencing the concern you were trying to address.
So can I ask a question for the group? What is the next frontier of the movement? What is the next challenge? What happens 10 years from now when Ashley is running the 20th anniversary of the Bend Toward Justice conference? What is this panel talking about? What are we wrestling with then?
Can I jump in on
Please.
that question? I'm moved by the way Fatima kind of teed that up, because I think if we just win some bills, if we just pass some legislation, if we just kind of hold some electeds accountable, we will have lost.
Yeah.
I really do think there is the kind of question of the soul of this country. It is about confronting its history in a true and real way, in a way that's inclusive and brings people along. I think Mara's reminder about how important it is to kind of let people evolve and grow, to heal the community and heal the nation and be a model, a light unto the nations for all nations, about what a community of healing and inclusion and equity actually looks like when we don't just get more votes and push our thing through and then crush the other side, but model the kind of justice. Like, what would it look like if we modeled the kind of justice we fight for? If the electoral process, if the Congress, if our politics were as sacred and as human and as dignified as what we believe in, that would be transformational.
Okay, thank you.
One thing I think, and I agree with all that, absolutely. But one thing I think we will work on now and we will need to continue to work on is the growing delta between rich and poor. I mean, for the last 3.5 decades or so, we've had this growing delta. And we are seeing the results of that in, I think, our body politic. And it's quite unhealthy. And I think, the same dynamics, people talk about the Rust Belt, but the same dynamics that are occurring on the Rust Belt are occurring in the inner city, are occurring on reservations, where you have some people who are year after year gaining the great benefits of our economic system, and many, many people that are on the losing end of that. And if we don't find a way to fundamentally restructure the way things work, I think we're just going to continue to go down this path of division that is quite unhealthy for our society. And it's not just happening here, it's a worldwide phenomenon, because we are switching from a industrial economy to an information economy. And with that change, you need different rules for your economic system, not dissimilar than when we went from a mercantile agricultural economy into an industrial one. So I hope this movement, and I hope entities like the Leadership Conference of Civil Rights, who has led on this issue, will continue to lead on this issue, because I think it is an issue that can unify this country in ways that others can't.
Right, thank you.
Remember that the rules breaking down, which seems to be happening, can be a good thing or a bad thing, right? There was a really neat story a couple days ago that you probably all saw about moms who are in Congress wanting to take their kids onto the floor of the House, and people are like, but there's never been kids on the floor of the House. Well, I mean, who really ultimately cares except parents who want to bring their kids onto the floor of the House? That's not the most important rule that's breaking down, but a lot of our societal rules are breaking down, a lot of our cultural rules are breaking down. And we can either look at that as a tragedy, and in many cases it is. We can also look at it as this amazing opportunity. As the environment, our physical world is also breaking down in some really dangerous ways, and our economic system is bifurcating people in some really dangerous ways. What are the rules that we have to be part of making? The Rabbi's right, we can't just pass a bill or two here or there and think we've made a success. When the rules are changing, we have to be part of making the rules. They have to be more just rules, they have to be more practical rules, and they have to be rules that we want to live with. And so I think the rules are really an important part that sometimes we don't focus on enough.
I'd like to ask a question for the group because all of you have invoked the term justice, or you've talked about what is just. Has the civil and human rights movement ceded the ground on morality? So obviously there's more discussion about saying what is moral and what is amoral. But over the course of the history of the United States, the law has been weaponized against people of color and women. Scripture has been weaponized against women and people of color. The economy has been weaponized against women and people of color. The criminal justice system, the list goes on, and all of them have been weaponized by people with an amoral agenda. So the question is, have we ceded that ground, and is there a way of taking that back?
It's interesting. I actually think that's one of the things that's really important that's happening right now, is that culturally you are seeing tremendous shifts and rejection of things that are harmful to people across communities. And I do think that undergirding that is some sense of what is and is not good, what is and is not fair, what is and is not just. And so that cultural work and those cultural conversations, I actually think are what in part are sustaining our work right now, right? Because we have been in this period for a couple of years where it has been the people power in the courts and not a lot else that has been helping us. And that the people power piece of it, having a clear sense of this is wrong, naming it immediately, showing up powerfully and collectively, even when you don't have anything individually at stake, or you think you don't have anything individually at stake. So I actually don't think in this moment that the civil rights community is ceding any ground. I actually think the civil rights community is surrounding that, and that is the leadership that has been the most exciting in this period.
Oh, go ahead, please. I think that's eloquently put, and I agree with it. I would add that, I think that these constructs, whether it's justice or liberty or what have you, it is always going to be an eternal battle to define what that means. It always has been in this country, and it always will be, because they're so vital to our understanding of ourselves. If you can capture the narrative with respect to what is liberty, what is freedom, is it Lochner kind of freedom, a Lochner era kind of freedom, where you have a freedom to contract and therefore can stomp on workers' rights? Is it the religious freedom and liberty to discriminate? I mean, there's all that term, these terms of justice, freedom, liberty, these are terms that we have to always battle to define.
Rebecca.
I think if there's really anything that we've seen in the last few years, and everybody on the panel has touched on it in one way or another, is the fact that we really have taken that notion of that, like, my liberty is tied up with all of your liberty. My freedom is tied up with all of your liberty, or your freedom. And while the other side may use those terms, I think we've expanded those terms. I think people talk about using your faith as a sword or a shield. And I think while the other side has been really good about using it as a sword, like, I think we've sort of gone into like phalanx mode, as it were. And as we move forward, the fact that we have each other's backs, we are our siblings' keepers, and we have to be. Like, and I think if there's anything the day after the 2020 election, it's how we maintain that. Like, we have built such, like, allyship, I was saying earlier, allyship is not a merit badge. Like, we treat it like it is. Oh, you have now been dubbed an ally, now go forth and this will get you like a 25% discount at Wendy's or something. But it's work, and it's work that we have to hone ourselves daily to show up for each other, to pull back when we need to pull back, to actively do the work of examining our own internalized racism, homophobia, anti-immigrant sentiment, ableism, etc. We can't forget that the day after we get these folks out of office.
And if I could just jump in on that, we saw this in Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
I was in Pittsburgh hours after the massacre. And what I saw in Pittsburgh truly transformed my deeper understanding of what you just described. Because what I saw in Pittsburgh was a Muslim community that rushed in, not only to raise hundreds of thousands of dollars for the Jewish families who were mourning, but committed to stand in solidarity outside and protect their Jewish sisters and brothers. And I saw an African-American pastor who spoke at the vigil, who not only named and acknowledged the suffering of the Jews who lost so much, but that the Jewish community had acknowledged that their suffering was bound up with the suffering of the 2 black people who had been murdered in a Kroger's just a couple days before because their church was locked, and 3 years before in Charleston, South Carolina. And that pastor also acknowledged that this synagogue was the highest synagogue, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, who had committed to work with migrants and refugees and asylum seekers, which is why that white supremacist targeted that synagogue, because they were standing for immigrants. And so when immigrant folk and disabled folk and black folk and white folk and Jewish folk and Muslim folk and all folk come together, that is when we will actually be the civil rights movement that we believe in.
And on that, ladies and gentlemen, please a round of applause for our panel. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Desmond Meade, Florida Rights Restoration Project, and Judith Brown Diana's Advancement Project.
Good morning. Good morning. Hello. For those who don't know me, my name is Judith Brown Dianas, and I am the Executive Director of the National Office of Advancement Project. And I am so excited to be here. I want to thank everyone at the Leadership Conference for having this discussion. To my good friend Vanita, love you and love what you're doing. I'm honored to be here to have this conversation with one of my heroes, Desmond Meade. Desmond Meade heads up the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition that did something really big this election cycle. They actually got rid of a law that was passed right after Reconstruction to disenfranchise newly freed black folk. in the state of Florida. I'm excited because he also knows, he and his wife know that I consider myself a ride or die for them. So I'm happy to be here. So I want to get into this conversation with him because for those who don't know, Amendment 4, probably everybody in this room knows. Why don't you tell just what Amendment 4 exactly is?
Wow, that's a great question, Judy, because it is just so much more than what I can talk about, because it is so deep. On its surface, I can say that Amendment 4 was a constitutional amendment that restored voting rights back to individuals with felony convictions. And
how many people is that?
That's 1.4 million people who have served their time. But that's on its surface,
yeah,
and I know that.
Get into the deepness.
Yeah,
we gonna get into that.
No, because I remember Advancement Project has really been involved in an effort over the years because we knew that the explicit right to vote was not in the Constitution of the United States, and we really wanted to get that in there. And one of the strategies was going state by state and really making that happen, right? Well, what Amendment 4 just actually did was actually created a constitutional right to vote for people with felony convictions. And that is huge. And I think that that's something that needs to be really lifted up.
So Desmond, let's start with this question, because in looking at Amendment 4, and not just Amendment 4, but the work that led up to it. So we met, Advancement Project was one of the original groups in the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, started in 2003. We met about 2006 when you came on board. And I would say that the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition took a huge pivot when you came into leadership because it was personal.
Yes.
Why was it personal for you?
Well, it was personal because I am a returning citizen. And I'm not, ashamed to say it now, but because of drug addiction, I got in a lot of trouble, and I was in and out of jails and eventually prison. Eventually, my addiction brought me to railroad tracks and had me standing there waiting on the train to come so I can jump in front of it. But thank God he had other plans for me, right? And I crossed those tracks and checked myself into treatment. And after I got out of that, I moved into a homeless shelter. While there, I enrolled in school. And right after I enrolled in school, part of this experience that I had in treatment was that in order for me to maintain my sobriety, I had to get engaged in service. I had to give back. And so I dedicated my life to giving back. And in doing so, that's when I was introduced to Florida Rights Restoration Coalition. So my engagement with the organization was purely personal, and so when Governor Scott came in and undid the policies and made it worse, everybody else could go home. I couldn't, because I still could not vote. And so I think it was an experience. I think it was fitting to have people who are directly impacted in those leadership positions, because there's a certain level of tenacity that can only be there when you're directly impacted.
So 2006, you start FRRC. I remember being in a meeting in Orlando in 2010. Fair districts had passed, and we were all getting together to talk about what was next in Florida. And I remember you standing up and saying that it's time for us to get rid of this provision in the Constitution. And there were so many naysayers in the room. There were people who were, funding collaborative people to progressive organizations who were saying no, and who were saying it's not time yet. It's not time. Let's wait. We got an election coming up. It's going to be about this candidate. It's going to be. So I remember that, and I remember standing up and being like, y'all are wrong. Y'all are wrong. 69% of the people believe in this. How'd you bring them along?
That's a great question. it was this phrase, I think it was from Field of Dreams that said, build it and they will come. You know, there were so many people who did not believe it. And I kind of understood because, number one, they didn't have the vision. Number two, they were not directly impacted, right? And number three, that they were used to a system that says that only certain type of people can lead certain efforts, you know. And so I knew what God put in my heart to do, and so I kept it moving. And, you know, we have allies along the way, like Advancement Project, never left. Folks that stood in the paint, and more than, you know, I got to give a shout out, because so many times, the only time we give black women credit is when we talk about voting, right? But I could tell you right now that throughout my journey, you know, from my wife, from my mother-in-law, from my sister, it's always been a black woman that has helped hold me up. In times when I couldn't stand on my own, they were there. And they stepped up in major ways, and I know if it wasn't for my sisters and for the love of my life, you know what I'm saying, that I couldn't have made it. And so I know that God gave me the helpmate. He gave me the people that was in place to help push on in spite of everyone saying that you're crazy, it's not going to happen. You know, they didn't understand what faith really was.
And we have tissues because we're both criers. He's like the one movement person that makes me cry every time. So he knows that, and he, does it well. So, not crying yet. Yeah. Not get me yet. But these naysayers, so let's talk about the process, right? Because the process was, first of all, in Florida, you have to have over 60% of the people have to vote for, to approve a constitutional amendment. You had to get petitions signed. And I remember you were getting petitions signed when wasn't nobody trying to give y'all no money. And, you know, you were doing it out the back of cars. Big Mama, who's Sheena's mother, was at it in the back of her car. I mean, this was grassroots from the beginning when no one believed. Just talk a little bit about that process of like that petition collection and how you did it. And then eventually people came to the party and helped, right?
Yeah.
But before they came to the party, what was it like?
And, you know, let me tell you, there was a time when, you know, there was some resentment, you know, when you were looking out, you know, pleading, you know, when I would come up to D.C., I would spend my student loans just cold calling on folks, just pleading and begging folks to understand how important this issue was and how transformative it was. But and even though it seemed like no one wanted to pay attention, that, you know, there was some resentment there. But I understood through my even spiritual relationship with my higher power, who I choose to call God, that sometimes he takes you through some things. So even when he took me through me being homeless and being hooked on drugs and about to kill myself and all that, I went through that because he was preparing me for greater work, to be of greater service. And so what I started to realize was that he was doing the same thing with this campaign. You know, because if the people didn't abandon me, I wouldn't have gotten the experience that I've gotten. If they would have came when I first called, we would not have had we would not have been successful, because it was the organic nature of this campaign that laid the foundation for us to be successful. And it allowed us the space to not find some brilliant political strategy, you know, to win a campaign, but to go back to the simplest of things. When you talk about the author or the man who talked about bending an arc towards justice, that was the same gentleman that talked about that hate can't drive out hate, right? That fear can't drive out fear. It took love to drive that out. And so it allowed us an opportunity, because all of the experts didn't think we were going to win. It allowed this campaign to be truly led by a higher power. And because it was led by a higher power, at the core of that was about love. Right? And that broke down racial barriers. It broke down partisan lines. It broke down, I mean, come on, when you think about it, you have voting, you have felons, and you have Florida. Those are three volatile subjects.
Who would have thought, right?
And
like,
you put that all together, right? You put that all
that
together.
sounds like a loser.
Of course, it is a loser, right? But what happens when you put that all together in an environment as toxic as we live in today, but yet not one major opposition against it? Then he got over 5.1 million votes, which I tell people that those 5.1 million votes was not votes based on fear or votes based on hate, but over 5.1 million votes based on love, forgiveness, and redemption, right? And when you look and you see that those votes was over 1 million more than any candidate got on that ballot. And that when you looked at the 67 counties in Florida, you seen that we got the majority of votes in 62 out of 67, right? This is the same toxic issue, but yet we had our Jewish brothers and sisters. We had our Islamic brothers and sisters. We had our conservative Christians. We had our AMEs that was representing, right? And you had even our Latino evangelicals. How could you get such a hodgepodge of people singing the same chorus of love? That's amazing. And I believe that what happened on November 6th is something special enough for this entire country to take pause and to really analyze. Because I believe that somewhere in that victory is the secret sauce to how we move major issues in this country.
That's right. That's right. So, so I want to move to November 6th. So the days leading up to the election, so Advancement Project, we usually are on the ground doing our little lawyer thing and all that. And I was like, I'm not doing that this time. I'm knocking on doors. And I took Jesse Williams, our board member, the activist, with me. We were in South Florida, knocking on doors, and then I came up to Orlando, actually came on the Let My People Vote bus, slept on that bus. And I would say for me, like, what was important for me to do in that moment, while so many of my colleagues were in Georgia, doing really important work. For me, it was important because I had seen this journey, and that I had seen the work that you and your family and a coalition of groups had done. And I also know that from prior years of doing litigation in Florida, that this was one of those issues that we had to take care of. And so as I was knocking on doors, and I've done canvassing years ago in Florida, but again, like the same thing of knocking on doors. I asked Sheena Roll, who was helping them with the campaign, I said, send me to the hood of the hood of the hood. I'm not scared. They're my people. And so I was knocking on doors, and so many of those people were people who could not vote, and who, when I engaged with them, they knew about Amendment 4, though. And they were excited about the potential of Amendment 4. And they understood that January was going to come, and for them, some semblance of freedom was finally going to come. And so tell me about, like, that moment. So I was there for the victory party, and we were in a ballroom, and I remember, like, that was a crying moment. Tell me about that moment when they called it.
You said a lot just then. So much is just running through my mind now. Yesterday, I revealed for the first time something that I never told anyone. Not even my wife, believe it or not. And I tell my wife everything because she's my best friend as well. But I had carried a burden for quite a long time during this campaign, because as a person of color, I felt extra stress or tension, knowing that if we did not succeed, that would be a reason for folks to say that's why we don't let people of color lead major fights. And so that was an extra burden that I had to carry, because I knew that I wasn't just talking about liberating 1.4 and creating a more inclusive democracy, but also for the skillful and extremely competent men and women of color that was out there that was not given that opportunity to lead major campaigns or to be funded properly, that there was that extra burden there to win that. And so on that night, when those final numbers came, that was a huge burden that was lifted off of me, But I tell people, when you talk about when you canvass the community, and this is, like I said, this is no kind of slight to any of our great folks that was running. But I told people, and you heard me at the church when I told people that the most important person on that ballot, name wasn't on that ballot, but Pookie was on that ballot. Shaniqua was on that ballot. Ray was on, Desmond was on that ballot. When my wife went to go vote on that ballot, the most important thing for her was liberating her husband, giving her husband the right to vote. And that came across that night. That came across that. We're talking about igniting or reinstilling hope in over 1.4 million people in Florida. And there's nothing more powerful than hope, And so I believe that, when that ticker went down and you seen us all jumping and tearing down the stage, it seemed like that was a release. That was a release of 150 years of oppression. That was a release of years of being told that we weren't good enough, that we had other fights to fight instead of our fights. That was a relief to know that, listen, a person of color can be strategic enough to maneuver a campaign in treacherous waters and come out of there unscathed.
So it was one of the most beautiful moments of my career to be there. And I remember there was a sister who was videotaping. She was doing Facebook Live, and she was crying and saying, "I can vote, I can vote." And Desmond brought all of the members of FRC, the returning citizens, to the stage because he always centered the people who were impacted. And that is so important. And so, from Advancement Project, like the work that we do is all about impacted people leading their own movements. And the importance of that because of the genius in impacted people and not discounting that. And so I want to also just lift up the beauty of the movement because of impacted people being at the forefront. And just want to ask you, I've got two more questions for you, I think. One is, so what's your, we got a room full of folks from national organizations, some local organizations. What's your lesson learned about impacted people leading their own movements? What advice do you want to give the room? The proof is in the pudding.
Listen, let's be real, especially in Florida, we, over years and years, we haven't much to celebrate in Florida. But here it was at one time, and matter of fact, no, let me change that, because there were two major ballot initiatives that was won on November 6th, right? And both of them was led by people of color who was directly impacted. Norris Henderson in Louisiana, he led vote to Amendment number 2 that got rid of this Jim Crow law that allowed people to be convicted without having a unanimous jury, which was amazing. And then, of course, Amendment 4 that now established voting rights for over 1.4 million folks and beyond, right? And I think the proof is in the pudding. When you let people who are closest to the pain, you give them the space not only to lead, but you give them the space to fail. Let me back that up again. You give them the space to fail, because the difference between a Harold Miner and a Michael Jordan was Michael Jordan was allowed to play through his mistakes. Harold Miner kept having to look over his shoulder and never materialized into the great player that he could have been. Give us room to fail like everybody else. Give us the support financially like everybody else. And like I tell people, listen, I've seen where people who have historically lost get funded in droves. So listen, we're on, like in the words of one of our great DJs in Florida, FRRC, our new theme song is all we do is win, win, win no matter what. Fund that. Fund that. Fund winners. And we're giving you that opportunity to do so.
So, so that folks know this work was not just about the amendment, right? So we did a report called Democracy Disappeared, released early before the election, that showed the impact of disenfranchisement on communities of color, and how in every neighborhood where there are high concentrations of people who could not vote, you got all the things you would expect: high poverty rates, low education attainment, high unemployment. And so we know that this is important. And so Amendment 4 wasn't just about getting the vote, right? It was about building power. This was not transactional. This was movement building. So talk about what's next.
That's a great question. You always asking great questions. But part of that, too, is like, you know, a lot of people focused on the 1.4, but what we knew was that there was an additional 2.4 million people who was registered, where a lot of those individuals were related to people who couldn't vote. And so Amendment 4 was not only just about liberating or re-enfranchising the 1.4, but to also re-engage. And so when you talk about what's next is that we want to embrace the spirit that got us to win by making sure that we continue to not do business as usual, right? So many folks right now rushing out there trying to find felons to register and all that, you know. Listen, we register folks. You can register 1 million people, and if only 10% of them show up, we got a problem, right? And so we know that as we're moving forward into 2019, our goal is to change the way we approach even registration, knowing that we have to layer other things on top of that to increase the likelihood of people being civically engaged and in tune and knowledgeable about the issues and being able to vote, right? And so that's what our what's next is. How do we build out, FRC has 12 chapters throughout the state of Florida, how do we build those chapters out, engage in peer-to-peer registration and engagement? How do we work with our allies and our partners, making sure that not just the 1.4, but it's way more than 1.4 million that's not registered in Florida, and they need to be engaged in a way, because we cannot continue to be ignoring people and then scratch our head wondering why they don't come out to vote, right? And so our job and our commitment is to reaching out to the folks who have been neglected, who have been marginalized, and engage them and empower them in such a way, because when that happens, then we see the beauty of democracy.
So Desmond, I want to thank you for allowing me.
One person got it.
To be
one person got it. I don't think the rest of you all got it, but that lady over there in the yellow, she got it.
Look, she's been getting the whole thing, though. She's been getting the whole thing the whole time. So I just want to thank you for allowing me to be a very small part of a major part of history that was made in this country. We all should be thanking you for correcting the wrongs of the past, for giving our people another chance, and to shifting democracy. So I want to thank you, and thanks everybody for your time.
So I just want to thank, because I know there's many of you all out there, folks representing different organizations that have played some role or another in our victory, and so you need to continue standing and give yourselves a round of applause, because it truly was a collective effort. It truly was. So thank you all so much. Now we can eat.
Right.
Everyone, please remain seated. Our program is resuming.
Yes. Yes, that's right.
So I don't want people.
We got it. Let's go back.
Okay. Lee, can you take a photo of the celebrity? Or actually, we'll do it.
And the big old.
Hi, all. Okay. If folks can please take their seats. This has been an incredible morning. It has been so inspirational. Can we give Desmond Meade another round of applause? That's the kind of advocacy and activism that fuels our fight and our movement. I have the distinct honor now of introducing a person who has spent his entire life fighting for civil rights and for justice. When he was mayor of Newark, long before criminal justice reform was popular, was bipartisan, had broad mass appeal, Senator Cory Booker was fighting in the streets to push for reform, to push for racial justice, and to make change happen. He has always understood how interconnected our fights are, how interconnected our communities are, and why we have to build coalitions to win. He is a movement builder, and there is no question that he is a moral voice in the Senate. But he's not just a moral voice, he is getting things done. And sometimes he is the face of that work and of that push. But I gotta tell you folks, now as being president and CEO of the Leadership Conference, I see how much Senator Booker does behind the scenes for which he never gets credit. The amount of pushing, the amount of reaching across the aisle to make things happen, to make sure that we can have as meaningful a criminal justice reform bill in Congress that can get passed, pushing, morning, noon, and night. With Thomas Farr, and I already said this morning, there's a lot out there, and we should all thank Senator Scott. But there was a person who was having impassioned conversations with him, showing him the record of what Thomas Farr did in North Carolina. Senator Booker was tireless in seeking the defeat of that vote suppressor. And I think it is incredible to me just how constantly accessible he is to the civil and human rights community. This stuff is in his blood. Senator Booker is a good friend. He is a fearless leader, and he is just plain old fierce. Please welcome Senator Cory Booker.
Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. So I am really just grateful to be here. One of the smartest things I've done this month is to leave my office early and be able to sit over there and listen to Desmond Meade, who just was truly heroically inspiring to me. But that's what we are to each other. Gwendolyn Brooks says we are each other's business. We are each other's harvest. We are each other's magnitude and bond. I was just introduced by someone who has been like that to me. Vanita, who is the president of this conference, has really been someone who has sourced me through her leadership, but more importantly, her friendship. We talk so often about criminal justice issues, human rights issues, on the phone, strategizing, going back and forth, but always she lifts me and elevates me and sort of charges me up and pushes me back into the fight. I have a definition of revolutionary leadership that I lean on that comes from a book called In Search of My Mother's Garden by Alice Walker, where she talks about the true revolutionary. And she says the true revolutionary is always concerned with the least glamorous stuff, the raising of a child's reading level from 3rd grade to 4th, the filling out food stamp forms for folks because people got to eat, revolution or not. The real revolutionary is always close enough to the people to be there for them when they're needed. That's the kind of spirit that Benita has, and the spirit that I know is in this room. I was looking around and seeing a lot of people I recognize from the fight. And I'm just grateful for you. And I want to share with you some of the things on my heart today, as I just came from a meeting with leadership, Schumer and Durbin and others, where we were talking about a criminal justice bill and the possibility of getting something done this Congress. And it really is one of those moments where you're sitting in these gilded rooms with painted ceilings, and you know you just got on a train from Newark, New Jersey, and you hear policy discussions and numbers mentioned and statutes mentioned all in these bills. But as I sit there, I know that those numbers and those legal terms all affect my community. I'm the only United States senator that lives in an inner city, black and brown neighborhood. My community, the median income according to the last census is about $14,000 a year. And that's household income. And I moved in this community back in the 1990s. And back then it was really off the hook, at least that's what I thought. Because when I first moved there, I was moving my stuff into my apartment that I rented, and came back to my car, my stuff was stolen. There was a 24-hour sort of drug trade going on the street, punctuated by shootings I would hear often at night from my bed. And I still remember being overwhelmed by a lot of the challenges on the streets as I was still a law student trying to get immersed in the community. And I'll never forget this woman named Miss Virginia Jones, who became one of my great life heroes. I always say I got my BA from Stanford, but my PhD on the streets of Newark from professors that were far more brilliant, insightful than many of the ones I had in school. And I'll never forget that this woman, one of her first things she did with me was have me stand on the street, and she said, if you want to help me, you got to tell me what you see around you. And I said, what do you want me to do? She goes, describe the neighborhood. So I described the neighborhood, and she just looked angry and upset. This elderly woman, 5 feet and a smidgen tall. She just looked, the more I talked, the more she just looked disappointed and angry with me. And so finally she looks at me when I finish, and she goes, you can't help me. And I'm like, what do you mean? And she just turns around and starts walking away. And I run after this woman, and I grab her from behind, very respectfully, mind you. And she wheels around, and she looks at me, and she says, boy, you need to understand something, that the world you see outside of you is a reflection of what you have inside of you. And if you're one of those people who only sees problems and darkness and despair, that's all there's ever going to be. But if you're one of those stubborn people who every time you open your eyes, you see hope, you see love, you see the face of God, then you can be one of those people that helps me. And she walked away. You see, when I'm in my community, we have challenges. Again, I don't know if any other senators had shootings on their block this year. Shahad Smith was murdered at the top of my block this year, a young man that I lived with when I lived in the projects on the top of the hill. I live across the street from a drug treatment center. I sometimes have sat with the men and women in those circles, and I just see beauty, I see divinity, I see God. But I also hear their stories of people who had a disease treated with incarceration after incarceration after incarceration, who've been chewed up by the mechanisms of power, but yet somehow elevate with inspiring grace and dignity. In my community, I go to my bodega and I see people who work full-time jobs using food stamps to still try to get by, because we are a society that's stripping the dignity from work. In my community, on 4th of July, I hear parents, talk to me about what it means when some people hear fireworks, but when communities like mine, people have continuing, not post-traumatic stress, but continuing traumatic stress. I live in a neighborhood that's about a mile or so from Superfund sites. Most Americans don't know that Superfund sites are going up, not down in America, because now we have this sort of Grover Norquist, no new taxes. Reagan and Mitch McConnell back years ago authorized a small tax on the most polluting industries to clean up Superfund sites, but they didn't reauthorize it in this day and age. So Superfund sites are festering and growing, toxic environments are growing. We now know that children born within a mile or two of Superfund sites have 20% higher rates of birth defects, autism. Communities like mine are communities where people realize that some folk have an easier time finding unleaded gasoline than unleaded water. People think Flint, Michigan is an anomaly. There's over 1,000 jurisdictions in America where children have twice the blood lead levels in Flint, Michigan. Can't plant in the soil in my neighborhood. We have a big urban garden. We had to put planter boxes down because you plant in that soil, and the plants are toxic because of the lead. I come to Washington from Newark, from a community which I have lived now for 2 decades. Policies down here matter. I see that the bigotry and the racist policies of decades ago, housing policies that redlined neighborhoods, did FHA loans, and created walled-in ghettos. Literally, my family, when we moved to New Jersey, had to get a white couple to pose as us to buy the home I grew up in because they were steering black families away. And so when you have communities in which the air is toxic, the soil is toxic, the water is toxic, in which violence and gunshots give people traumatic stress, where you have shrines on street corners often, and I'm not saying, look, my mayor is an amazing man, he is driving down the violent crime rate, but you still see those shrines of teddy bears and candles on streets where you have a criminal justice system that is dramatically different in this country, depending on the geography in which you live. There's no difference between blacks and whites for using drugs or selling drugs. But if you are African American, you're almost 4 times more likely to be arrested for those things. You get more likely to get convicted, more likely to get the mandatory minimum. Where we have a country, as Brian Stevenson says, that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than poor and innocent. The community I grew up in another part of New Jersey, my friends did so many things wrong. This is what Brother Mead was talking about room to fail. Children will fail. From the time they start walking, they will stumble and fall. And in my community I grew up in, a predominantly white community, kids used drugs, experimented with drugs. Kids did crimes. On senior cut day, some of my friends went in to buy alcohol with fake IDs. Place was closed. They kicked in the door, stole cases of beer. That is a felony. They got caught. And what happened? The right thing happened. No charges, no nothing. The right thing happened. Kids in my community in Newark have no margin for those errors. They get chewed into the systems. As we sit here now, there are thousands of children sitting in jails for weeks, if not months, who have yet to even have a trial. And they're sitting in environments that other countries call torture. That's solitary confinement. There has been a national culling in communities like mine, a culling of human beings' potential by pulling more and more people, the most marginalized folks in our community, people who are low income, people who are mentally ill, people who are addicted to drugs, black and brown people, and